Good evening, everyone. Hello, thank you. Well done. That was very good. It's lovely to welcome you all here in this fantastic space. For those of you that don't know, welcome to Josey. Please come again. Please sign up to all of their mailing list for all of their events because it's a brilliant, brilliant space. And I'm from the Bookhive, by the way, and it's excellent for us to be in cahoots with them tonight. Us as booksellers. And a caveat to that is, through no fault of our own whatsoever, and for once I do actually mean that, there are no books to sell. Tim's book, which came out at the end of last month, we've had in the shop, we've had it since it came out. But when it came to getting the stock for tonight, that has been on order for however long, and we called and said, yeah, it's coming, it should have turned up Monday, but it didn't come, Tonight, they're not here, because this morning, half of the order that they're supposed to be on was sent somewhere else. Perhaps Milton Keynes, perhaps somewhere that cares about Cézanne more than we do. It doesn't matter, they're not here. But in this day and age, with so much that's going on, is blame really worth bothering with? I think it is. UPS are the people that we are going to blame. I apologise for that. However, Tim being a semi-local boy, I'll get him to sign copies that you order tonight, and we'll send them to you, or you can come and get them from the shop. It's fine. It just means that you can still come and touch the cloth of the great man. That's not a problem. You can still speak to him. You can still pretend you're getting the actual book signed, but actually you'll just be telling me your name and perhaps your address. Either way, we'll get you that book. But that's all the icing on the cake of tonight's great event. Having for 25 years worked in theatre and then publishing, I've had the great misfortune or fortune to know a lot of people with some notoriety and some whom I call my friends. But I can honestly swear to you that none, literally none, have the same impact as when you drop the name T.J. Clarke in the right place at the right time. He is a giant amongst I was going to say men, but I mean people in his sphere, and there are so many of them. Art historian, yes, of course, as we all know, but poet and essayist and writer and critic and a man whose eyes are the eyes that we all wish we could see so much of modern life through, and a Marxist. Whoa! Which, frankly, after today's great news, and it's getting better and better and better, it's our great privilege to be associated at long last, because Tim and I have been talking about trying to do something together for a long time, but to make it happen and to make it happen here is a real honour for us. So thank you very much to Josey, and thank you very much to Tim, and I'm going to hand you over to Johnny, who's going to be interviewing Tim to introduce tonight's talk specifically a bit more, but just for now, would you please welcome both of them, Jonathan Watts and T.J. Clarke.
Thanks for having me. So, yeah, my name's Jonathan, and I co-run Josey Gallery with Ben Brett, who's sitting over there in the corner. Tonight is, in fact, the second time that we've welcomed Tim to the gallery in the last 12 months. At the end of last year, Tim joined the artist Terry Atkinson in conversation to discuss Terry's extraordinary exhibition. Some of you may have seen it. That was across two spaces, this space here and up the road on Willow Lane. And these exhibitions consisted of drawing and collage titled East Berlin, Prussia in the Desert and American Civil War. And Terry, as some of you will know, is a co-founder of Britain's most influential post-war conceptual art collective called Art and Language. And after leaving sometime in the mid-70s, went on to develop a kind of practice of history, drawing and painting that explores legacies of colonial conflict and warfare of the 20th century and earlier. As part of the exhibition, Josey was able to reproduce an excerpt of Terry's correspondence with Tim on what was then Tim's recent book called Heaven on Earth, Painting and the Life to Come, And we actually have copies of that book here this evening.
Oh, yeah.
Some of them are signed as well by both Terry and Tim. So
takes 5 years.
Yeah. So purchases of those books goes directly back to supporting Josey's activity. But of course, we're here tonight to talk about Tim's new book, If These Apples Should Fall, Cézanne and the Present. I have to say that my reading of this book has really been nourishing, and I think not least for the insight that Tim offers of his own encounter with Cézanne. When we're reading Tim, we're reading Tim's encounter with whoever that artist is. And we're going to talk a bit more about the book tonight. But reading the book really prompted me to think about the ways in which my own encounters with Cézanne had been kind of mediated or framed by writing. In particular, one of the kind of giants of modern art criticism, Clement Greenberg, but also the phenomenologist Maurice Merleau-Ponty, and the philosopher Jacques Derrida, who starts the book The Truth of Painting by examining an aspect of Cézanne and his exchange. I think there's a timeliness to this book, certainly because, about 2 weeks ago, Tate Modern opened a major retrospective of Cézanne, or survey, of Cézanne's work. And what really intrigued me about this location is that, while there are wonderful Cézanne works in the National Gallery, and they mark a kind of historical limit to the collection, here's Cézanne in another national institution that's more often associated with contemporary art. I was saying to Tim earlier, I tried to go to the Cézanne exhibition, but I didn't book in advance and it was sold out, so I couldn't go. So instead I took myself across the bridge, went to the Barbican and saw the Carolee Schneemann retrospective at Barbican. But what was very interesting here was that here I learned that Schneemann's painting of the 50s had been in direct dialogue with Cézanne, and that later Schneemann, rhetorically or not, it doesn't matter, later Schneemann claimed to believe that Cézanne was a female artist because of the name Anne in the name, and would go on to develop performances around this misapprehension. It's an homage nonetheless, and I mention it, I think, because it was readily available, it was just there when I couldn't get into the Cézanne. But I think that it's kind of evidence of this kind of diffuse, ongoing influence of Cézanne throughout the 20th century. And if you've looked at the Tate catalogue, you only need to see that, there are many artists, among them Ellen Gallagher, the painter Luke Tymans, the painter Etel Adnam, Paul Chan, the great sculptor, to name a few, who have reacted with and against Cézanne and responded to Cézanne in that publication. And I think what's very interesting, and this is certainly addressed in the book, is that Cézanne is this kind of most honorific of things, which is the artist's artist. And I was also saying to Tim earlier, last week, we were very surprised but also delighted to get an email from the great no-wave painter, German painter Jutta Kutter, who wrote this emphatic email saying that they'd read the new book of Tim's in a kind of dreamlike state, and I only mention that because I want to venture that Tim is the artist's art historian.
Certainly not the art historian's art historian.
If we look at the Tate catalogue, we also find an acknowledgement of significant new insights that are offered by Tim's writing on Cézanne, but this is the essay that was published in the London Review of Books in 2020 on the strange apprenticeship, as you put it, between Cézanne and Pissarro. And what's interesting is that only 10 years earlier you'd written in the LRB, and this segues into my first question, that it was no longer possible to write on Cézanne. And you begin chapter 2 of the book by recounting this review that you wrote of the London showing of Cézanne's Card Players, and you write, "I've been mildly surprised since the review of the Card Players to find that its opening sentence, the idea that Cézanne cannot be written about anymore, has gone on to be my most cited remark and among my most unpopular."
There are several competitors. But yes.
So my first question really then, just to start this off, is I guess I want to know what you meant when you wrote that Cézanne couldn't be written about anymore, and is this book a rejoinder to that?
Yeah.
To that comment.
Yeah. Well, I'll answer that, but I really do have to just say one or two thank yous. This is it's great to be doing the book launch here. Without books, but you know, what do you expect? It's Trussonomics, I guess. Yeah. I'm really sorry that happened, but anyway, you know, I will sign them and we will get them if you want them. But there are all kinds of reasons for wanting to do it here and being so pleased that we could do it here. First of all, that I have such a high regard for the Bookhive and a love of Norwich as a city, and all kinds of connections with family, daughters, sons-in-law, and grandchildren who live nearby. So you know, it's a local affair, and I wanted that to be the case. And as Jonathan mentioned, this is also a follow-up to an occasion that I was, really very moved actually to be at with Terry Atkinson. It was actually the first time I'd seen him for decades.
Yeah.
And although we were very close friends and are close friends, and it happened here, and we were surrounded by his drawings. And so when Henry said we're going to do it at Josey's, that just made it even better. Yeah. So thank you to you all. Cézanne, what was it I said? Something like Cézanne, who was the touchstone for art writing for more than a century, cannot be written anymore. I mean, I just got back to England, and I was excited about writing for writing regular criticism for the LRB, and I shouldn't have been so brash, right? And it sort of haunted me, that aphorism. But there was something to it. I mean, I think that what I was trying to say was that it really isn't clear any longer how to write about Cézanne. Even if you, like me, have lived with Cézanne your whole darn life, right, since being a teenager in the 1950s, and I can remember the shock of seeing a Cézanne for the first time on the dust jacket of Shapiro's book and thinking, what? So what's this? What's happening here? It wasn't exactly this one, but it was another still life very much like that, actually, which is also in the Tate. This is in the Tate show, and the Chicago still life is also in the Tate show. So you're sort of looking at exactly the kind of painting that sort of had me transfixed, but not knowing why I was transfixed. So I've lived with that for a long time, but as you said, for the century, and you could almost call it the century of Cézanne, people, of course the best writers were full of puzzlement, but there was a confidence about Cézanne as the father of modern art, right? Well, what does that mean? It's a flesh-crawling kind of. Actually, at the Cheltenham Literary Festival 2 weeks ago, in spite of me, they gave my session that title, but that's Cheltenham, isn't it? And all those categories are rightly under suspicion. Father of modern, right? Fathers. We've had enough of fathers. Carolee was right. He probably was a woman. And modern art, after all. What on earth is modern art? One of the most wonderful essays it is a wonderful essay for all its strangeness now, looking back, is Greenberg's essay, which was in, a socialist journal in New York in 1948, Cézanne and the Unity of Modern Art. And do we think there's was such a thing as modern art? Do we think it has a unity? Do we think that unity was its value? Because that seems to be implied, that Cézanne was the master of unity. Anyway, we could go on about that, but all of that, I think, has sort of disintegrated and left us thinking, well, okay, I mean, Cézanne's still around. You get in front of his picture, especially if you get in front of it in a gallery, in Tate Modern, surrounded by many, many other very various works produced in the 20th century or the late 19th. And it still looks, well, for me, it looks stranger and more puzzling than most of the rest of them, even those who are trying hardest to be stranger and more puzzling. It's actually exactly the fact that you think, well, this guy wasn't trying to be strange and puzzling. He was trying to make sense of what seeing was like. What is seeing? How does it occur? How on earth do we represent it? But it was sort of, it's precisely that sort of straightforwardness, almost naivety. This is what painting should do, but then you end up with this extraordinary strangeness, right? Everything, a tilt, everything at some strange kind of distance from you, for all its vividness. Everything aligned, and yet the alignments and the fixing in place seems to kind of confirm the fact that the world is so weird. Look at the way in which that folded cloth continues in some strange blue horizon. Look at the ice block wall behind. Is it a wall? Is it a crystal? What on earth is it? Look at it can go on, right? Perhaps, and look at the way, what seems to begin as sort of hard, precise seeing and noting of seeing seems to spin off into something else, which is following a different kind of logic. My sign of that in this place is these two wonderful apples nestled behind them. And look at that shadow behind the apple, and then what happens to the shadow line. That's a kind of tiny detail, but it's actually, you can see things like this happening everywhere in Cézanne, right? Sort of something that seems to start off as an annotation of visual sensation, then sort of going into something which, well, what is it? How does the shadow become part of the pattern on if that is what it is? It's actually rather unconvincingly part of the pattern on the blue curtain or whatever it is. And that's there all the time in Cézanne. Just look at the twists and turns of the straw and the holder on the bottle and the ginger jar, and the way in which they kind of interwrap with each other to make something which I think you can sort of make sense of it, but it's also challenging you to make sense of it. So it's all that extraordinary mixture of vividness, straightforwardness, proximity, familiarity with something else that's going on, which really leaves you sort of gasping, really, you know, exactly what's being said then about seeing and representing.
To come back to this way in which you have to kind of make sense of that tradition of writing about Cézanne, and try and find presumably another way to do that in order to,
Yes.
you know, because you've decided to write the book and that's
Yes.
come out of various articles. One of the things that you write is that only a kind of narrative of repeat looking will do. You know, so what's so striking about chapter 2 is that you introduce this journaling method, which is something that you've done before.
Done
right?
before,
you
yeah.
know, the sight of death is,
Yes.
is kind of predicated on this
Yeah.
idea of repeat looking. But what's very striking about that to me is that you are trying to synthesize and also slightly sort of do away with a priori knowledge or preconception, some kinds of preconceptions, in order to develop a way of writing that attends to this strangeness or this disequilibrium that you've just described.
Yes.
So can you tell us about that process of journaling, of how you found, you know, the right way of writing for you?
Yes. Well, it happened twice, you know, and each time in the Getty, really. I mean, obviously, I do it. Hopefully, when I have the chance, I do it all the time. Go back and back, and because certain paintings just transfix you, and you want to see them again and again. But the two times I've tried to write that out, I've been at the Getty in LA, and that was because, you know, I sort of had the chance to go back day after day after day. I was in the, you know, I was in the Getty Research Institute and sort of, you know, living nearby. But for this purpose, it was great because I was able just to try to persuade myself that I was looking from the ground up, you know, looking from a blank. Obviously, I wasn't.
Right.
But I went in and, you know, and I was surprised by things.
Yeah.
You know, the first thing I saw were the two apples there, kind of nestling behind there. So what I just pointed out, that was at least I thought it truly was the first thing I just was struck by. And then I said, and then I tried to think about, well, why? And you know, there were many levels to that. And then I went back the next day, and the first thing I was struck by was the black bottle and that kind of interweave of line, and so on and so forth. Right? You know, I mean, none of it's innocent. But you sort of are trying to deprogram yourself to the extent you can, and just sort of come in, see something, start to think about it, put your thoughts and what you're seeing down on paper. And that was, it's anyway, I think it is a good way to write about painting. But I think it's particularly, I thought it might just be a way of putting down on paper this moment we're in, where some of us at least, you know, still think Cézanne is the touchstone. But we don't want to end up repeating the old souls, you know. I can't remember which group it was, Anne will remember. Wonderful group in the 60s had it's a very good number actually. Cézanne, the reckless father of Cubism. And it's a very good rock number. Yes, and it was exactly. I mean, they were already laughing at it. You see,
right.
Cézanne, the reckless father of Cubism.
Yeah.
And and after Cubism, abstraction, and after abstraction, more and more flatness, and so on.
Yes.
This is a sort of a way to try and get out of that. Those assumptions.
Right. Because but there's a very striking part in where you're describing journaling leads you to this really interesting insight where you talk about the way that this tipping and tilting is directed to something beyond itself.
Yeah.
And then we move to more familiar territory. You reach for the hearts.
The sacred text.
You reach for the
Yes, I mean it's a sort of moment. It did really happen.
Right, but there's something ironising about it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I have to tell you what happened. At a certain point, surprise, surprise, it came into my mind a moment in chapter 1 of Capital, in which Marx says, the thing about the commodity, the object in the commodity world, is that you don't know whether it's an object or not, and you don't know where to have it. And of course he, as a voracious, devoted reader of Shakespeare, immediately that clicks in his mind and he remembers Mistress Quickly. Well, it's Falstaff who says of Mistress Quickly, you don't know where to have her. And she's outraged and says, you damn well do know where to, and so it's bawdy, it's obscene, and but of course it's extraordinary that he's using these spatial metaphors, right? The thing about the commodity world is that space has become the object has sort of disappeared into not disappeared, it's very much there, but is it touchable, is it manipulable, is it, as in his terms, does it have use value anymore or merely exchange value? And the whole passage is full of this trying to grapple with the way in which objects have taken on a different kind of reality for us, an enormously powerful reality. I mean, they've become our wishes. God damn them! But they also have power over us, right? Your famous moment where he says, it's like religion, where the inventions of the human mind take on a reality, and we believe that they are inventing and moving us. And he thinks the commodity does the same thing, essentially. Yeah.
So are you suggesting that Cézanne, who famously, he's a complex character in that he read widely, was very well educated, and did spend time in Paris, but then elected to go and live among the peasantry in Aix-en-Provence. So are you suggesting that that somehow Cézanne is aware of this world that Marx is discussing and the kind of commodity nature?
No, Jonathan, really not. Really not. I mean, look, if what Marx is saying has any purchase, then we would perhaps expect others from different points of view to converge on the same kind of insight, right? Saying, well, I started off. Look, I mean, what? Okay, let's just go even closer, or maybe this is better. Yeah, these two. This is fantastic. And by the way, they're side by side in the Tate show. This is in the Met, and that's in the Getty. And I never thought I'd actually see them side by side. That's very, very exciting. Actually, just turning aside for a moment. Sometimes people say, "Oh, come on, it just happened that way. And your idea that he's somehow or other more and more fascinated by the unstable as he develops his picture, isn't that really sort of pushing it too hard? I mean, it's almost like compare and contrast the two, bottle and ginger jar, bottle and ginger jar in the two. It's almost like a control. Oh, I'll line them up here so there's no funny business, and the hollow here gives you a clue to the hollow of the bottle, and so on and so, So, I mean, it's almost as if he was saying to himself, yeah, there's a dialogue between these two pictures, right? And in the one, I mean, this is, as you say, there's just one or two moments where the old big names come on, and I do say that bottle, what happens in and around that bottle is like a deconstruction, right? A Derrida type deconstruction of the bottle, right? It's sort of showing you, the shape of the bottle, but it's also destroying the shape of the bottle, right? It's showing you circularity, and yet the circularity is sort of collapsing and becoming infinitely a matter of representation. So the answer, Jonathan, is no. Anybody less likely to have a clue about the chapter 1 of Capital. I mean, Pizarro, of course, read the whole of Capital,
right?
And and so I'm not saying he never heard the word Marx.
Yeah.
He darn well, because Pizarro is such a.
Well, maybe we should talk about. There's so many things that we could talk about. But perhaps before we talk about Cézanne and Pizarro and this strange apprenticeship, I think you recognise in that first encounter, that teenage encounter in the 50s, the kind of the strangeness, the kind of portentousness, I think you describe it as, of Cézanne, and really this idea of like a sort of distance and proximity, this nowhereness, I think you call it. It runs through the entire book, and it's not just in relation to the still lifes. You also think about it in relation to the landscapes and the interior views of the card players. But maybe it's a big question, but maybe you could talk about how it features in the landscape and the interior. Sure.
Well, it's probably actually a good way is to show you Pizarro and Cézanne side by side.
Yeah, okay.
On the left-hand side, Flooded Fields, 1873, by Pizarro. And on the right-hand side, probably only a couple of years later, Pool at the Jas de Buffon by Cézanne. Actually, one of these rare pictures that he signed. I'm not so sure that isn't a acute accent on the E. Anyway, that's a bit of art historical. But look, I mean, I'll cut to the chase. I mean, Flooded Fields seems to me full of a tremendous confidence in the physical reality of the world it portrays, and the social reality, actually, of the world it portrays. And look at that awkward house come factory in the background. Exactly not the kind of structure that Cézanne would ever have taken on, or if it was there, it would be reduced to, it wouldn't be reeking with the strangeness of the 19th century. I mean, the social strangeness. And I mean, look at the solidity of the planting of the tree, in the water, and the reflection and so on. And then look at Cézanne. I mean, the Cézanne is wonderful, but it's sort of absolutely weird. its whole sense of space and relationship is so. You just can't. Well, talk about you don't know where to have it.
Yeah. Well, you write.
Yeah.
You write. The relationship was the deepest mystery of the 19th century, and I can't escape the feeling that if we could unravel it, we would have in our hands the key to French painting.
Yes.
But there's a wonderful story that I think comes from Pissarro's. Is it from his son?
Yes. Yeah.
Where
Lucien. Yes.
who recalls observing Cézanne and Pissarro working in the field.
Yes.
And this. I think you begin your chapter on their relationship
Yes, I
with the
do.
story. But maybe you could tell us that story and and
It's a lovely story. I mean, see, a lot happened between the two of them. I'll show you just this famous moment when Cézanne took a wonderful, quite large Pissarro from 1871, just 2 years earlier, of Lucien, and did a copy which is sort of just about that size to that. It's not bad, that relationship. Sort of, not about 2/3 size. Very faithful, but also he can't do it. I mean, look at the kind of charged weight of the atmosphere, and the kind of amount of agricultural detail always in Pissarro. Pissarro, is interested in a peasant economy and what villages are like. That doesn't, either doesn't interest Cézanne, or he doesn't see it, or he can't do it, but it's a very, very close relationship. What a wonderful act of humility to sort of take this work and, copy it. So he is an apprentice, and yet so quickly he moves away into his own space. And the story you were talking about was a lovely story that Lucien says that once, actually, not only did he copy, they painted side by side sometimes, and then, equally interestingly, Cézanne just sort of lay on the grass and watched Pissarro paint.
yeah.
And a peasant comes by, apparently, Lucien says, and said, your work is not putting in much effort. So it's extraordinary. It's a wonderful relationship.
Yeah.
But the relationship sort of, for me, sums up everything that is going to happen in Cézanne. That Cézanne cannot help himself moving towards a sense of I don't know what the words are really, but at one point I risk what I say is a cliche about modernity, that modernity is loss of world. And I do say that Cézanne, that may be a cliche, but Cézanne is the painter who makes that cliche, horribly, but also beautifully vivid, right? Look at the way this tree, this tree's reflection, what is it? And this tree's, I also say at some point that this is a world where a non-person might feel at home. Compared with Pissarro, where you can just, you can just imagine walking into that with Wellington boots, but it's real, it's materialized.
Yeah.
Whereas Cézanne is sort of proposing to us, I'll show you the world, but where is it? What is it?
You also say that Cézanne sought out Pissarro to move away from what you call the first style, which is often a kind of earlier, it's often characterised as being a kind of cruder style of painting.
Yeah, it's a wonderful style. I don't actually have a slide of that, but there's some good pictures from the very early moment in the Tate show. And his fellow artists really, they knew how good he was. They thought he was crazy, but they in a certain sense, idolise him. I mean, you go to the Tate Show and have a look at a picture called The Battle of Love. I think that's sort of stupid name. It's about, it's about erotic. So Cézanne is an idoliser of Delacroix. So they're all trying to redo Delacroix's sort of, sadistic, misogynist nonsense, right? Craziness. The massacre of Sardanapalus and all that. That's their paradigm of what's the word now? Where you break taboos.
Transgression?
Yeah, transgression, whatever. So this picture is about male and female struggling but enjoying the fight, insofar as you can make sense of it at all. I mean, there's a threesome in which a huge phallic dog is sort of participating in the fight. Who owned this picture? Pissarro.
Right.
So, go figure, right? They kind of know that this strange man, Cézanne, is doing things which are none of the rest of them would dare do. So he does that. He does all of that. And then he says, no, this isn't what modern art can be. Modern art must be about the nature of seeing,
right,
and humility in face of the visual, how the world occurs to us. That I've said this many times in what I've written, is that I think they go back to this bedrock because they are deeply disgusted with their civilization. They don't believe in any of the values that are on offer. Certainly Pissarro didn't. And so what are you left with? Trust your own sensations. Trust, and so, in other words, trying to do Delacroix erotic drama, no, that'll only lead you into another branch of kitsch. So all you can trust is eyesight.
And when Cézanne said famously, I see in touches, is that
Yes.
that's right. I mean, what did he mean?
Yes, well, that's...
Sorry, that's a deceptively simple,
Or telling
naive
me.
question.
Yes, he says it several times. Je vois partage. And it's one of the most difficult remarks. I see in tache, right, which is daubs, patches, marks, but I see by, because it's par. Je vois partage. So this actually brings us, I mean, this is really hopelessly difficult, and I don't think the book ever gets this sorted out. But I think that on the one hand, Cézanne's art is spellbinding because it seems to be about the very nature of seeing. But then it is also spellbinding because it is about the very nature of representing. What is it to represent? What does the mean in representing? Should we trust it? It seems to mean that we're representing something that was present before we started representing. But you don't need to be Derrida to think that the very concept of present is very difficult, really. And aren't we human animals that live completely within representation? There's no present before representation for us. So that at least, and I don't know how I dramatize. Oh yeah, okay. Yeah. I mean, right? It's is this a picture of a mountain, or is it a picture of picturing a mountain? I mean, never. Sorry, need a bit of air. Yeah, I bet you do. Never has painting been so much shown you the business of putting paint on and the way in which sequences of paint sort of seem to have their own logic, their own dynamic. They build on themselves. They have their own rhythm. And the real difficult question, seems to me, is how those two questions interleave and sort of contain one another in Cézanne, right? What is it to see? What is it to represent? But we can't disentangle the one question from the other. That might be to do with the peculiar moment in history we're living. Might have something to do with the commodity, everything, modernity. Or it might just be that, well, that's just the human condition. You'll never work out. You'll never work out what is there and what you're making there, right? Yeah.
I think this. I don't want to jump ahead actually, but this is kind of how the book concludes, right? Of like it's the house near Jardin where you make this into an allegory of painting, but you also talk about this kind of. I think you say something, that the world is strange, and that the picture is always reality. So there's a kind of an inversion that takes place. That somehow
I'll show you that
it's the
picture. We can come back to these wonderful things, but here we are. What a extraordinarily beautiful picture, but totally chilling at a certain level, right? The house, never has a house been less of a home, right? It's less human. Yes, that's right. I say at one point, well, maybe it's even an allegory of painting, and the house is the painting, right? Sort of planted in this landscape, and yet profoundly not part of it. It's fitted into the landscape beautifully, but it doesn't really belong there. It's kind of an alien presence. There's an amazing moment in 1935-36 when the great playwright and novelist Samuel Beckett sees Cézanne for the first time, and he writes to his friend called McGreevy, and he says, "Oh my God, at last we're free of the puerilities of landscape painting with its trumped up emotions of the hiker." And at last the landscape is shown us as a completely alien reality to us, having absolutely nothing to do with us. Incomprehensible arrangement of atoms. And how dare we think it has anything to do with us, right? It's as insolent as Aesop with his attributing emotions to animals, right? You know, so he goes on at some length about it, right? Now, look, I think this is, I mean, you know, Beckett is another extreme modernist case, but he is speaking to something, isn't he, in these works? You know, that they do show us and I was saying to you before, this is the way in which even the naive claim of the subtitle of the book, Cézanne and the Present, might work. Mm. That actually, I mean, you know, in our burning planet, it might well be something that we still learn from, right? You know, look, if you look hard enough at landscape, you realize it's not landscape, it's the material world, and you know where we are in it is a matter of negotiation, if not catastrophe. You know, and if ever a painter seems to have sort of put the world at a distance, right? You know, and sort of made it not ours. It seems Cézanne, and that, you know, that is something which.
And that is distinct from the sublime, the classic idea of the sublime,
yes,
because it's predicated on.
Yeah, this isn't sublime.
No,
is it?
right.
Never has a mountain been less sublime,
yeah.
But it's at a distance from us, right? You know, and it doesn't. It's not. You know, yeah. I mean, the sublime is all about our emotion in the face of the infinite and the enormous. Cézanne, the infinite, the enormous. These are kind of human categories, you know, which are sort of gobbling up the world and sort of, you know, forcing it into our terms.
It's a really fascinating denial of subjectivity as well. I mean, I was sort of mentioned this to you earlier. I was thinking about the way in which the idea of a modern subject is formed around the turn of the 20th century. That there's something about this also. We could think about it as kind of resisting that kind of figuring of a modern subject. Can I? I'm slightly conscious of time because we've been talking for about an hour.
Oh yeah, well,
now.
should we? I think.
But I've just
one last thing.
I've got a couple of questions that I want to ask, and we could obviously just keep talking, and but we can't do that. I was really fascinated. Oh, there's two big questions though. I was really fascinated by the way in which the book, quite aside from Cézanne, but the way in which the book tries to address certain methodological orthodoxies of social art history, which you are associated with.
Yeah.
So you ask at several points what constitutes a field of comparative or companion images or art in context. You go about kind of trying to revalue the power of the aesthetic, which has become impossible. Well, not impossible, but it seemed embarrassing or somehow not, you know, of the day. And also, you do this thing where you encourage a freer or a sort of wilder analogy of art with music and poetry, which is something that art historians are slightly resistant to for fear of being accused of kind of trans-historicism. And then at the end of the book, you dispute this big binary of art for art's sake and then politically engaged art, which somehow this story gets reduced to in the early 20th century. And so, I mean, there's loads of stuff there, but I'm just interested, as somebody who was so influential in, you know, social art history, how you then talk about the problems of ideology, production, history, and how and what your thinking is on that.
Yeah, well, it's far too big a bigger set of questions, but I'll give you a sort of, you know, I mean, on the one hand, as you know, there's a sort of trivial level to this, right? You know, which is you're supposed to have your brand, you know, age 35, and stick with the brand for the, until you're 80. Well, this isn't real life, your interests change, your questions change, and so on. And I have no loyalty to my brand whatsoever.
Right.
But that's the trivial level. I mean, the real level is the same questions are there.
Yeah.
The question is, what has art got to tell us? And how does a particular work of art stand in relation to the world it is made in and for? And I still think those are the questions that, I'm asking of this. It's just that, look, Manet or Courbet are artists who thrive on making circumstances present in the work.
Yeah.
Right? And finding form by exulting in the appearances, the superficies of modernity. Cézanne doesn't. He's not beyond a certain point in his growing up. He's not interested in the superficies of modernity. He's interested in the structures of modernity. What does being in the modern world feel like? If we think something has happened which is robbing us or reorienting us of landmarks and belonging and being in touch, how on earth do we represent that? It must be happening to our whole sense of the world. So what part of the world we show, I mean, he does, of course, right? Look, where are we? Yeah. I mean, he does show us parts of modern life, right? These are peasants. These are peasants playing cards in the cafe. Roger Fry, bless him, was completely convinced that Cézanne just sat there in the cafe painting them, and because everybody thought he was a mad old buffer in X. And they probably thought, yeah, okay, let the old guy paint his painting. It's a ridiculous painting, but he's not stopping us playing cards. So these are full of, I think I end this chapter about the peasants. Now this is a charged question for anyone painting in the 1880s, 1890s, because the peasant is the mythic figure, the hero of the Third Republic. And the tragic liver of change and of dissolution of the old ways. And Cézanne's friends in Provence are all Provençal nationalists, and they hate the modern state, and they want the peasant to be part of a resistance to modernity. So it's all charged, this material. But I tried to make the case in this chapter that actually, slowly but surely, Cézanne works his way towards a feeling for the solidity and implacable dignity of these characters, but also the fact that, look, they're like us, they're moderns like us, right? They're, there they are in the cafe. I mean, look at that cafe, especially in the Cortot one, which is this one on the right, which I love even more than the one in Paris. This cafe background, well, it could have been done by Degas. It's full of the kind of full of the ambiguity and impalpability of modern life, if you want, and just look at what happens to the table and their relation to the table from one to the other. I think the Orsay one was painted first, I believe. That's by Hunch. And, this one where it's still stable, but it's less stable. And they're all, look at this one. I mean, he leans back for a moment, his chair might fall over. There's instability even here in these pictures, which are about as composed and simple as Cézanne ever does. So that's my answer, really. He's not the kind of painter whose feeling for his time wears its heart on its sleeve. But it's deep, and it's there, I think, if you talk about it.
Should we
Yes.
open up to the floor?
Yeah,
We've been talking for an hour. There is no roaming microphone, obviously, but just project if you could. Any questions? Hands up. Thank you. Yeah.
I hope this isn't a really dull question, but looking at the images, I've been wondering if you had any reflections on Cézanne's attitude to finish, or his relationship to the idea of completing a picture, and whether that had any connection to this, like his feeling for the touch, for the mark.
Yeah. Well, I think he had tremendous. I think he thought very, very hard about what it meant to finish a painting, and like most of his, his cohort, he loathed the idea of fini, right, finish. But he very rarely signs a picture for all kinds of reasons. But he does sign that one, and that seems to definitely mean, when they're not signed, it certainly doesn't mean he didn't think they were finished. But when he signs it, that really does seem to. And that is usually because there's an exhibition of some sort in the offing. So he thinks, okay, if I'm going to have to show, I better sign. But, so that's a finished picture. But it sure ain't a finished picture in ways which most of his contemporaries would remotely have understood. So yeah, I mean, controlled unfinish is part of it. There's nothing new in that, right? It goes back to, God, goodness knows, goes back to Michelangelo. But it certainly goes back in French painting to Delacroix. And yeah, I think that's good. Please.
To what extent did he consciously formulate this approach to modernity as looking at structures and below the surfaces? Or was that something that he discovered par touche as well?
That he discovered, what was that?
To what extent did he think to himself, consciously formulate the idea that, no, I've got to look at structures? What you said earlier about the structures of modernity.
Yeah.
Or was that something that he found par touche as well?
Yes. Well, if Terry Axel was here, he wouldn't like my answer to this, because he always thinks that he thinks deeply that painting is always mediated by thinking in words. I don't. I think that painting is. It is, of course, it is, and we're language animals, and we can't escape from that. Fact, but I think that I absolutely don't think that Cézanne ever put it to himself, I'm finished with the look of modernity. The modern, he did one called A Modern Olympia, right, redoing Manet. But I'm finished with that, and now I'll go for the deep structure. No, he didn't, but he apprenticed himself to Pissarro, and in the process of working through to this way of confronting the world, he found himself. I mean, it is an extraordinary story, isn't it? He found himself doing something so profoundly different from Pissarro. So it's the painting, I think, that's the thinking. I think that's the best I can do. Yeah.
Do you, well, in the paintings I've seen here, there seems to be like, you can tell that he's not content as a painter. There's also a kind of like indulgent in the craft itself, like the things play with each other.
Yeah.
Do you think he liked being a painter? Like, do you think he enjoyed painting? Or do you think it kind of embarrassed him? Because I do think there's that kind of feeling of like comic embarrassment that like runs through it.
No, I think he loved every minute of it. You know, I mean, he was a laughing stock in his own town. Aix-en-Provence is a revoltingly smug place, you know, still is. And nobody in Aix ever bought a painting by Cézanne. The French state in the end had to send them a couple of Cézannes, late in the, you know, what a story. But it's a relevant story because this not belonging is very important, I think. So he didn't belong. I mean, of course he had affection for his landscape, enormous. But he was consumed by painting. I love that story that somebody once asked Lowry, you know, so what are you doing when you're not painting then, Mr. Lowry? I'm thinking about painting. You know, and I think Cézanne was like that. You can't do that, can you, without just sheer delight, really, as well as puzzlement. Yeah.
It just seems like so at core like funny that like he spends all his time representing things, but like at the centre of that representation is like a criticism of representation itself. But yeah.
Yes, it's not. I wouldn't say it was a criticism of representation itself. I would say that it was questioning it all the time. I wonder what this is I'm doing that is so wonderfully absorbing. There's a lovely critic who, in 1905, woman critic, who says about him, he stands in front of nature in the attitude of a question mark. Mm-hmm. And I think that's great, really. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think there's a question.
Yeah.
Me?
Yeah, please.
So what I was noticing was the first two pictures we were looking at, or the first picture with the apples falling.
Yes. Shall I go back? I'll go back and then.
Yes. So it was the depth of the shadow when you were talking about it. If you look at where the shadow of the apple, there's two apples next to each other, and the way it goes down. And then I was looking at the depth of the shadow, and looking at picture the Anish Kapoor black. And that, in fact, already is that depth of black. And the first thing you notice about that picture is the light. But then you suddenly look at the shadow and you realise it's the shadow that's telling the story. It's the depth of the dark colours. And I was wondering whether that has something to do with the weirdness that he represents, what he's looking at, and that's what he's trying to show. It comes through in the shadows and the dark colours. It's the way it tilts towards the dark.
Yeah.
This sounds very much like Star Wars and Tolkien, but that's not what I mean. It's just, and it's not so much the contrast of the yin and yang. It's more the depth and the way it tilts towards the darkness, and that brings out this disassociation from reality.
This one
darkness.
in particular. Huh?
Yes, exactly. It's completely wrong, but he knew exactly what he was doing.
Yeah, I think that's right. And he works at it fiercely hard.
Yes.
You know, because not only is this like super black and then it goes, you know, on and on. Look at that kind of strange transparent yellow there.
Yeah.
On the other hand, you know, like almost like a spinning.
Yes.
You know, to emphasise the blackness, and you can just about see he's put a line of golden spots there along the top of the. So he is working like crazy to pin down the reality of that apple, and yet in the end, the reality is it's so completely peculiar. I mean, going back to your question about finish, this is super finished, but the more finished it gets, the more perplexing it gets, really.
And it's later in the reflection of the trees and the water. None of it really fits. The
No.
reflection, in a way, is the actual reality. If you turn the picture on its head, you
Yeah.
have what he's actually trying to show. Yeah, that one.
Yeah. Yes, of course, the reflection is far,
Completely weird.
far stabler than the. Yeah.
Thank you. There was one at the front from
Yeah.
Anne.
Okay, and then you.
Anne, did you put your hand up?
No, I didn't.
Oh, sorry.
Please.
Tim, obviously, it's wonderful, and what you bring out about the importance of seeing is clearly core. But a lot of people are seeing, but why is he seeing differently? And one of the things that I would fit into it, I think he was learning to see from Hippolyte Taine and learning from Taine's emphasis on the importance on the neurological basis of seeing. And he's really
Yeah.
the first person who isolated that as a key to human response to visual environment. And I'm wondering what you thought. It's a pedestrian territory here after what you've been taking us through, but whether you thought that Taine did have a really important influence on his mental process.
Yes. John, it's a wonderful question, and the answer is I don't know. I don't know whether he would, Taine, Hippolyte Taine is, a giant figure in the culture at that moment, and a fabulous writer. And Cézanne was a great lover of good writing. He used to come back from the mountain reciting Baudelaire's terrifying poem, Un charogne, a corpse, which is one of them, tremendous poem, but a really dreadful poem talk about material reality. But and he was steeped in Virgil and so on. So the idea that he's not an intellectual, that I still don't think he would have said to him, it's time for deep structure. But that doesn't mean he doesn't. He's very, very well read, very thoughtful, very intelligent guy. I don't know whether he would have read Taine. I think he surely would have known about Taine and about the basic theses of. So if we are to understand our contact with the world, it must be the nature of our brains and our neurology that now and. There is a very great friend of mine, and I think you know him too, called Paul Smith, who was professor at Warwick, who's been working on these things, all his life. Fabulous, and he's convinced, first of all, that Cézanne was actually steeped in much of the colour theory of his time, and was it perhaps in some sense really trying to put it into practice. Paul also thinks, and this, with your interest in neurology, surely this has crossed your mind, is that perhaps there was really something very special about Cézanne's very way of seeing, right? About his kind of eye-brain operation, and maybe so. Maybe we are dealing with somebody. It's been suggested. Well, was he on the autism spectrum? I mean, as far as I'm concerned, it wouldn't alter anything I've been saying, because, you know, the autism spectrum is a spectrum, and, you know, it enables kinds of extraordinary insight, and that would, you know, and puts you sometimes at a enviable distance from the world of assumptions and, you know, received ideas and received ways of processing sensation. So, you know, I have a feeling, John, that might be even more to the point than his reading, is that, you know, we might be dealing with somebody with a very special, you know, brain eye. Lucky him, maybe.
Yeah. I must say, I guess, obviously, I'm suspicious of that type of,
Yeah.
you know, sort of,
Yes.
it's the notion of the genius, the sort of somebody with
I know.
a unique brain. So I would rather stick to the things that I would be fairly sure about.
Yes. No, I couldn't agree with you more. And look, also Paul says, "Oh my God, I'm really worried about even entertaining this as, you know, a way of trying to think through, because yes, it plays into all this bullshit about the artist as unique and, you know, genius and madness going together and all this kind of stuff. Yeah. But of course, I also have to say, factually, historically, Cézanne was like that. You know, they all knew, his closest friends who loved him and respected him and admired him deeply, they all knew he was a very strange and special character. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, now I do have a question, and I sort of follow the tenor of the argument all the way to the very end, and when we are looking at the Mont Sainte-Victoire,
Yeah.
which would be wonderful to see again, I find myself sort of stopping at the idea, you know, what was wrong with this guy? Tell me one thing that could possibly be wrong with this guy, and if you can, then you are, you know, describing a certain realm of genius which can write the to joy, can, you know, be Valerian, can take representation into this, you know, highly exultant mode, and it makes a certain sense to a person who is certainly in the last, let's say, quarter of her life, that you that these are the sort of songs that one sings if one is at all enabled to sing a song. And I couldn't imagine putting that on some spectrum, except if I could then immediately roll up the spectrum after myself and be part of that spectrum myself.
Yes, I agree. I completely agree with that. But look, we now know that the power of the new study of autism is that it brings to the fore the fact that the organization of the brain, you know, is, right, these billions of synapses and so on, you know, right, is extraordinarily diverse from individual to individual, right? You know, it's not autism. Obviously, there are parts of it that are disabling. There are aspects of it that are profoundly enabling.
Yes, I think, but I don't know whether I'm sort of arguing at the level of the you know, the microbiology of the autistic brain. I think far from it.
Yeah.
I think that I think that there's plenty of room within older models of how humans exist, how they learn, how they change, that, and also, you know, how they themselves start to understand what it is that they're doing.
Yeah.
I may be
Yeah.
very old-fashioned here, but I don't.
No,
think we need it.
I'm with you. I'm with you. I just wanted to sort of entertain. I just want to do it. I certainly don't want people to go away and say, "Oh, I see. He was autistic." God forbid, you know, whatever that might mean. Anyway, you know, which is exactly the point at the moment. We're trying to understand the diversity of the real nature of the human brain. I don't care. I mean, that's not it. It is the fact that this man had a practice which absorbed his life, his attention, his energy, which was to inquire into the nature of painting and inquire into the nature of seeing and the relationship between the two, and to celebrate that relationship, right? To sort of make out of that questioning something so inimitable as this, right? Yeah. No, I'm not. God forbid that we think that there's a pathology and that's it. Yeah.
Yeah, can we make this last question?
There's Anna. Good. Hi.
There seems to be a disjunct to me between the attention that you pay to the strangeness that we see in Cézanne, which, you know, I completely agree with. You use the word weird quite a few times. But the fact that when I read Cézanne, I think he was just getting on with the job.
Yes.
You know, he was balancing what was out there and what was in here. Sensation and effet. And,
yes.
You know, it was quite a practical, constrained job. And I don't get the sense that he was walking around thinking, golly, this is weird. How do I get the weirdness down?
Yeah.
Am I right?
Well, I think it's a complicated question, or the answer is bound to be yes and no, because yes, he was very much down to earth, and the letters, as you suggest, are, you know, sort of hard-headed and instructive, and he's trying to talk certain of his correspondence down from what he thinks are too highfalutin ideas and so on. But the most extraordinary testimony to his conversation is this strange book called Conversation avec Cézanne by a man who was a real friend of his, very, very talented poet, journalist, writer called Gasquet. These conversations are fabulous, and they obviously contain a level of invention, right, on the part of this poet. This is this poet imagining what Cézanne might have said to him, but actually we can check many, many things against other kinds of testimony we have, much more, hands-on testimony and things we know Cézanne said. And he said one hell of a lot, and was full of, when he said, look, the landscape is out there, and it's like the fingers of my hand, but I will close the fingers of my hand, and in closing the fingers of my hand, I'll make a picture. The picture is the closed fingers of my hand, and there are many, many other. They tend to be wonderful sort of concrete metaphors, but they're complicated metaphors, right? And then, you know, towards the end he says things like, he points to a picture of a peasant, seems that he's working on, portrait of a peasant. He says, if I get this bonhomme, if I get this bloke right, the theory will be true. So theory is a very important word for him. And it's not a negative either. And then towards the end he turns to somebody, I can't remember, maybe Denis, and says, anyway, painting, it's inside there. So, you know, it's hands-on, and yet it's also, you know, it's intellectual. He's thinking hard about what painting is all the time.
Yeah, I don't doubt the complexity at all of what he's doing, but I do wonder whether he sees it as so strange and so dislocating.
Yes. I think that's a very good question, and I'm not quite sure whether we ever get him saying, oh Lord, what I'm doing is so... Almost. He does say towards the end when he's doing the big bathers, and I mean, crikey, never have there been such strange paintings. He does say, well, look at it. I've been working on this thing for 10 years, painting on plan pat, like Courbet. And he's really saying, I don't know what, I don't know what's going to happen, whether it'll ever come to an end. I mean, the very idea that he's actually turning to these admirers saying, well, here they are. I've been working on this one for 10 years. Isn't that a way of saying, whatever I'm doing, I'm not quite sure. Yeah.
We'll bring it to an end there, I think. It seems like a lovely place to end. So there are some thanks. I want to thank you all for joining us this evening and for your really, your attention. For what's been a really compelling talk. It's been a total privilege. If you would like to purchase a book, If These Apples Should Fall, Cézanne and the Present, which I suggest that you do, you can write your name down and they will be dispatched to you. We're also selling a book as well, So to Write, which is the exchange between Tim and Terry Atkinson. These are for sale. I should just mention that the programme is for Josey is having a bit of a break until after the Christmas period, but then in the new year we have an exhibition by a San Francisco writer, ceramicist called Bob Gluck, who wrote this wonderful book on Marjorie Kemp, which was recently reissued by New York Review of Books. He's showing ceramics for the first time, I think, ever. And then after that, into spring, we are showing a German artist called Elke Dender. And you're all invited to those exhibitions. Please join our mailing list. Finally, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you very much, Jonathan and Henry.
And
Ben.
Thank you.